Greetings and welcome to Resistance Rising with Johnny Cirucci. I am your host, Johnny Cirucci, on the program that brings you information that will set you free. Names, places, and dates that you will not get anywhere else. Well, we're taking advantage of this new partnership with First Amendment Radio to read through my first book, Illuminati Unmasked, published way back in 2015. I've learned a lot since then, but there is a lot of good information, particularly detailed information from just 5 years ago, that really begs the question, who's in charge? Why are they so evil? What is their agenda? This is the very purpose for so-called alternative media, is it not? Yet hardly anyone out there is answering these questions, no less asking them. Well, we're doing that now, and I'm using Illuminati Unmasked as the vehicle for that process. On the last episode of Resistance Rising, I closed with the original audio of Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta recounting what he overheard Vice President Dick Cheney say to a subordinate the morning of September 11, 2001, which was basically, shut up and carry on. Clearly, Dick Cheney was aware of something egregious and was cracking the whips over his underlings to make them carry out their orders. This is page 111 of Illuminati Unmasked. On September 10th, 2001, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld made the shocking announcement that he had lost $2.3 trillion.
Pentagon, the day before 9/11, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld declared war, not on foreign terrorists.
The adversary is closer to home. It's the Pentagon bureaucracy.
He said money wasted by the military poses a serious threat.
In fact, it could be said that it's a matter of life and death.
Rumsfeld promised change, but the next day, the world changed. And in the rush to fund the war on terrorism, the war on waste seems to have been forgotten.
My 03 budget calls for more than $48 billion in new defense spending.
More money for the Pentagon when its own auditors admit the military cannot account for 25% of what it already spends.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
$2.3 trillion with a T. That's $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in America.
It is impossible to have any kind of real concept or conception of those numbers if you were able to partially grasp those numbers in any way. If you were able to see the harm, and let me pause and not call that negligence. It is not negligence. It is criminal activity. It is mass theft of the American people on a biblical scale. And it is absolutely a capital crime. Did Rumsfeld and his handlers think it was funny to disclose that the day before the September 11th false flag that they conducted? Regardless of who you understand is behind 9/11, a rational examination of Rumsfeld's statement should easily put his head on the block and his bosses. Yet the number of people who were prosecuted for those crimes is the same number of those whose job it was to protect us from terrorists flying planes into buildings. The same number of people who were prosecuted after the United States government gave military-grade weapons to a vicious Mexican drug cartel. None. Back to the text. Rumsfeld was attending law school at Georgetown in 1956 when he was inspired to jump into politics. When something struck the Pentagon on September 11th, the location of the damage was budget and accounting. There is no video footage of an aircraft hitting the Pentagon, and the flight path presented to the American public for Flight 77, a number significant to mystics, by government sources suggests a near-inhuman accomplishment by a highly trained, expert multi-engine pilot. The majority of 9/11's Islamist hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, with at least 5 having received flight training directly from United States military installations. And as an aside, I have citations for everything I just said. Rather than focus on the involvement of supposed ally Saudi Arabia in the worst terror event on American soil, the Bush-Cheney-Rumsfeld administration sent the United States military to Afghanistan to guard opium fields and oversee a massive increase in crop yield. Over a decade later, Congress finally addressed 28 pages of the 9/11 Commission report that had been classified due to how badly they implicated Saudi Arabia. Critics saw this as a bait-and-switch distraction. Increasing numbers of Americans were beginning to question the official 9/11 narrative. American insiders implicated in the conspiracy were willing to sell out lesser international players, especially if there was little risk to them being ousted or prosecuted. A subheading: something far worse. Right after 9/11, 13 members of the bin Laden family were secretly escorted back to Saudi Arabia on one of America's presidential aircraft. Vice President Dick Cheney recently promised something far worse than 9/11 was on the horizon for the United States. In September of 2013, nuclear weapons were transferred from military facilities in Texas to South Carolina off the record. Shortly after that, South Carolina Republican Senator and reputed closet homosexual Lindsey Graham spoke to media about how America was under the threat of nuclear terrorism from Syria. He specifically mentioned New York City or Charleston as targets. This may have been the kindling for the most devastating false flag in human history, except military insiders turned whistleblower and gave independent media the story. Since then, there have been repeated purges of leadership guarding America's nukes. It seems a nuclear false flag attack is high on the agenda of those in control of the United States. The plan for a nuclear false flag attack on America was recently confirmed by world-renowned hacker Marcel Lehel Guccifer Lazar, the Romanian who broke into the personal email accounts of Colin Powell, George W. Bush, and several government agencies. Lazar claimed the targets he saw were Chicago and an unnamed city in Pennsylvania. Not surprisingly, he's in prison. Such devastation would not have bothered Barack Obama, as he's already stated America could easily, quote, absorb another 9/11, end quote. This is who has been chosen as America's leadership. Subheading: commissioned. The 9/11 Commission seemed to have the same agenda as the Warren Commission: obfuscate the truth to hide high treason conducted by the CIA and the authority behind them, Rome. The only thing compelling conspirators to give information up publicly was partisan finger-pointing. Under harsh cross-examination, Bush Attorney General John Ashcroft made a shocking accusation. During the summer of 1995, the then Deputy Attorney General wrote a memorandum that forbade the sharing of intelligence regarding international terror plots between agencies in the United States government. This memo was pivotal in covering the tracks of agents plotting 9/11. Many of them were operating in the American government itself. Ashcroft's accusation was that the author of that memo was Clinton appointee Jamie Gorelick, a member of the 9/11 Commission. When asked by journalists if they intended to question Gorelick on her culpability for over 3,000 American dead, the Republican chairman of the commission, former New Jersey Governor Thomas Keene, reported, "People ought to stay out of our business." Gorelick is a consummate career treason gatekeeper, having previously covered up the shooting down of TWA Flight 800. She was handsomely rewarded with millions from the Fannie Mae Freddie Mac housing corruption bubble, and later went on to apply her expertise with British Petroleum for the environmental terrorism they conducted on April 20th of 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico, the Deepwater Horizon oil platform explosion. BP chief executive Tony Hayward avoided crushing losses to his investment portfolio by selling the bulk of his shares in company stock just a few weeks before the disaster. Subheading: Not very intelligent. In the so-called war on terror, it would seem that intelligence gathering only works one way in the United States, whatever harms the American people most. Prior to 9/11, a listening operation known as Able Danger kept tabs on Osama bin Laden and anything he had plans for. Georgetown's own George Tenet, then director of the CIA, was perfectly positioned to keep that intelligence buried. I have this footnote on page 113. By giving a conflict the name, quote, war on terror, end quote, the Luciferian elite have ensured no end to the profiteering and bloodletting imposed upon the American people. When will, quote, terror, end quote, finally be conquered? Back to the text. As the 9/11 Commission was continuing its sophistry, Bill Clinton's National Security Advisor Samuel Sandy Berger used his clearance to enter the National Security Archives and stuff wads of highly classified documents pertaining to terrorist plots down his pants and into his socks to later be destroyed. He claimed he was trying to, quote, help the Commission, end quote. And the funny thing is, he wasn't lying. They both had the same agenda. When held to account by officials for obfuscating an ongoing investigation into the most deadly terror attack on United States soil, Berger had his security clearance revoked for 3 years by the Bush administration. I ask again, how is such bold treason spanning both well-kept political parties possible? It is being promulgated by powerful papists. As an aside, Berger, who died in 2015 from cancer at the age of 70, was a Jew who was also central to the Clinton high treason of slipping communist China designs on United States nuclear warheads. He was also a close friend of Jewish pedophile pimp Jeffrey Epstein, although Epstein was finally arrested and supposedly committed suicide in prison. None of his high-profile Catholic clientele have even been questioned. Back to the text. 9/11 was thoroughly enabled and coordinated by traitors within the United States. Sheep herders and Islamists living in caves had nothing to do with the level of sophistication. I have a citation from the New York Times. 3 of the men identified as the hijackers in the attacks on Tuesday have the same names as alumni of American military schools, the authorities say. The men were identified as Muhammad Atta, Abdulaziz al-Omari, and Saeed al-Ghamadi. The Defense Department said Mr. Atta had gone to the International Officers School at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, Mr. al-Omari to the Aerospace Medical School at Brooks Air Force Base in Texas, and Mr. al-Ghamadi to the Defense Language Institute at the Presidio in Monterey, California. Former San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown was warned to cancel his planned trip to New York City on September 11, 2001, and George W. Bush's Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice was implicated. What is the connection between those two powerful political figures other than their race? The unspeakable treason of 9/11 was overseen by Jesuit-educated director of the CIA, George Tenet, who received his Georgetown Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service in 1976. 9 days after 9/11, President George W. Bush mocked the American people in an address to Congress.
Americans are asking, why do they hate us? They hate what they see right here in this chamber, a democratically elected government. Their leaders are self-appointed. They hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other. They want to overthrow existing governments in many Muslim countries, such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan.
The real terrorists were the ones giving Bush his marching orders, and if there were ever any freedom of religion, freedom of speech, or freedom to vote before 9/11, they died in the onslaught of anti-terror legislation that followed. Subheading: Freedom of religion? It was George Bush's Attorney General John Ashcroft who helped seize the Indianapolis Baptist Temple on tax evasion after decision rendered by federal judge Sarah Evans-Baker. Many in the Bush family have been vetted by the Luciferian elite via Yale's Skull and Bones secret society, while Ashcroft would accomplish the same process via the parallel secret society also at Yale of St. Elmo. Subheading Freedom of Speech. In response to the staged false flag shooting that resulted in the death of federal judge John Roll and wounding of Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords in Tucson, Arizona, the Republican House handed Barack Obama the Federal Restricted Buildings and Grounds Improvement Act of 2011, which he quickly signed into law. The bill creates purposefully misnamed free speech zones that quell the right of protest around America's elite political class. Essentially, wherever the United States Secret Service is deployed, citizens are stripped of their First Amendment rights. I have as a footnote, by the way, the Indianapolis Baptist Temple was seized on January of 2001, but I include it as an example because George Bush has the false reputation of being a friend to Christendom. It also bears out my virulent criticism of career leftist women with multiple last names being wholly unqualified for critical authority positions such as federal judge. Back to the text, one would assume that such a clear violation of the Bill of Rights would quickly be nullified in a court of law. To date, no such ruling has been rendered, nor is it likely to be. Subheading Freedom to Vote. In 2010, the Tea Party revolution in response to the election of Barack Obama and the surly passage of the so-called Affordable Health Care Act, written behind closed doors, was crushed by the Republican leadership in the House of Representatives. The handful of upstarts who were elected that year were completely marginalized, and the Republican Party actively sought out existing fiscal hawks for punitive action, ensuring that the financial destruction of the United States would continue unabated. Subheading Pre-planned. On August 2nd, 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Iraq had been suffering heavily from war with Iran. In a surprising move of betrayal, several Middle East neighbors were worsening the cost by taking a loss in their oil output through overproduction to hammer Hussein. Saddam was mystified as to why Arab brothers would subvert their own self-interest to help crush the Iraqi economy. I have a citation from Tom Cooper and Brigadier General Ahmad Sadiq. During the Arab League summit held in Baghdad in late May of 1990, the Iraqi president demanded $27 billion from Kuwait while blaming Kuwait and Saudi greed for oil and equating them with an act of war against Iraq. Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates responded that they would lower their oil output, but, in essence, all the corresponding Iraqi demands were in vain. Arab countries continued producing more oil than assigned to them by OPEC, thus lowering the price. The result was that the Iraqi economy experienced increasing problems while attempting to recover from the long war with Iran. Back to the text. This same tactic is being used today to focus on another target of the one world elite, Russia. Kuwait was further provoking her neighbor by illegally tapping into Iraqi deposits via slant drilling and border disputes. In July of 1990, the United States ambassador to Iraq was told to assure Saddam Hussein that the United States would keep hands off as the Iraqis did what they needed to keep afloat. Next, I have a citation from Saeed Aburish. The record of the meeting on 27 July 1990 between Saddam Hussein and the United States ambassador to Iraq, April Gillespie, is now available. Saddam initiated the meeting at which Gillespie thought she was going to see Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz. Still, Gillespie gave Saddam something he had not expected. She told him in clear terms that America did not object to raising the dollar price of oil to a figure in the mid-20s and described the Kuwaiti-Iraqi border dispute as an inter-Arab affair in which America did not wish to interfere. The Saddam-Gillespie meeting was followed by considerable inter-Arab activity, which culminated in a meeting in Riyadh between Kuwait, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia on 31 July 1990. Iraq, emboldened by Gillespie's green light and friendly letter of 27 July 1990 from George Bush to Saddam, made much of the fact that it was being bled to death economically. Back to the text. Many considered George H.W. Bush sending a woman as an ambassador to a conservative Middle Eastern nation as inept at best and self-destructive at worst. In hindsight, however, Gillespie's gender may have made it much easier for her to be marginalized if the wrong questions were asked. I then have a citation from the Los Angeles Times. When April C. Gillespie was named United States ambassador to Iraq in 1987, she was, it seemed, a rising diplomatic star. Only 45 and one of a handful of experts in the U.S. on the Arab world, she was the first woman to head an American embassy in the Middle East. Today, Gillespie is a bureaucratic non-person. Although the State Department maintains that she is handling important special assignments, Gillespie is effectively being held incommunicado, forbidden to talk to either the press or to Congress. The ambassador's dramatic slide began last July 27th when, according to an Iraqi transcript that leaked out later, she told Iraqi President Saddam Hussein that the United States would not take a position in the growing border dispute between Iraq and Kuwait. Pardon me, I need to correct myself. Her name is more properly pronounced Gillespie. Back to the text. Within a month of the Hussein-Gillespie meeting, Iraq would invade Kuwait. Citizens in all nations were distraught over the chaos. Americans were concerned that the battle would precipitate a world war. Before a joint session of Congress, George H.W. Bush struck a discordant tone, speaking as if the turmoil was of no concern because an outcome was already determined, and world leaders from east to west were all on board.
And we stand today at a unique and extraordinary moment. The crisis in the Persian Gulf, as grave as it is, also offers a rare opportunity to move toward an historic period of cooperation. Out of these troubled times, our fifth objective, a new world order, can emerge, a new era, freer from the threat of terror, stronger in the pursuit of justice, and more secure in the quest for peace. An era in which the nations of the world, east and west, north and south, can prosper and live in harmony. 100 generations have searched for this elusive path to peace, while 1,000 wars raged across the span of human endeavor. And today that new world is struggling to be born, a world quite different from the one we've known, a world where the rule of law supplants the rule of the jungle, a world in which nations recognize the shared responsibility for freedom and justice. A world where the strong respect the rights of the weak. This is the vision that I shared with President Gorbachev in Helsinki. He and other leaders from Europe, the Gulf, and around the world understand that how we manage this crisis today could shape the future for generations to come.
The date of that speech was September 11th, 1990. Well, we're coming up on our First Amendment Radio break. If you're listening on Johnny's channel at Blog Talk Radio, we'll go ahead and conclude there for now. Tune in for more of Illuminati Unmasked, being read by the author, yours truly, Johnny Cirucci. This is Resistance Rising.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today, so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org. When it comes to prophecy today, much of the evangelical Christian world has their eyes on Israel, waiting and watching to see when the third temple will begin to be built. The plans are drawn. The Jewish people are eager. Most evangelical Christians today believe that the rapture will happen before the third temple is built. Hi, I'm Michael Eugene. I was taught that Daniel's 70th week was in the future. Is that really what the Bible teaches? Have we searched the scriptures and found this to be true? Why is it so important for a re-established Israel to build a third temple in Jerusalem? Is it necessary to build a temple on the same location already occupied by the Dome of the Rock? Is it necessary for sacrifices to take place in the temple on Temple Mount? Is there really a rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation? What is the New Testament temple? Can we identify history and prophecy? Who is the first beast in Revelation chapter 13? Who are the 7 kings in Revelation 17? I have asked all these questions, and I have found Nicholas Arthur's new book, When the Third Temple is Built, answers all these questions and more using Scripture to interpret Scripture. The Bible says that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Nicholas shows us in his new book, When the Third Temple is Built, how the Bible interprets prophecy and not man's private interpretation. Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org.
And welcome back to Resistance Rising with Johnny Cirucci. I am your host, Johnny Cirucci, on the program that brings you information that will set you free. Names, places, and dates that you will not get anywhere else. And I mean that. Names, places, and dates that not even the tiny handful that tell you about Rome will take the time to give you. I'm currently reading for you from my first book, Illuminati Unmasked. And last show we told you about how Yale Skull and Bones President Bush number 41, not to be confused with Yale Skull and Bones President Bush number 43, had suckered Saddam Hussein into attacking Kuwait, promising that the United States would do nothing, through Bush's female ambassador to Iraq, April Glaspie, then making a public speech to Congress that this was a prime opportunity for a new world order. And it is a speech that he made on September 11th, 1990. Back to the text of page 118 of Illuminati Unmasked by yours truly, Johnny Cirucci. As President Bush number 41 was speaking to Congress, military men at the Pentagon were putting the finishing touches on a plan already worked out to invade Iraq. The facilities there were working flawlessly as proof of how well designed the notorious 5-sided structure was. Its foundation was precipitously laid just a few months before America was dragged into World War II on September 11, 1941. Subheading: Why 9/11? Why has the date of September 11th been repeatedly chosen by Luciferians for advancing the one world order? Scholar in residence at Faithful Corporation, Dr. Michael S. Heiser, has an answer. Pause, and as an aside, I consider Michael Heiser, at best, a willing agent, we call them coadjutors, of Rome, and at worst, perhaps even an incognito ordained Jesuit, with how he carefully avoids the information critical to Christendom of Rome being the fourth and final beast, the great harlot drunk on the blood of the saints. Back to the text. Heiser is no armchair blogger. He earned his M.A. and Ph.D. in Hebrew, Bible, and Semitic languages. Again, as an aside, sounds like a Jesuit resume to me. Back to the text. Revelation 12 speaks of a great sign in heaven. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems. And his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she did give birth, he might devour her child. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Revelation 12:1-5. Heiser has taken this information and applied it literally. Some scholars contend that the gospel message was passed on as far back as Adam to his children, and they to theirs via the stars. Psalm 19:1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork." Job 38 may have spoken to this practice. As Yahweh chastens Job regarding his divine plan and wisdom, he asks, "Canst thou bind the chains of the Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Canst thou lead forth the Mazzaroth in their season?" That's Job 38, verses 31-32. This is the only place in Scripture where the Mazzaroth is mentioned. Its actual definition is in dispute, but experts believe it was an astrological discipline that utilized stellar constellations as aids in teaching Yahweh's message. Astrology has been subsequently perverted by paganism, much as other messianic truths have been. It is interesting to note that of the major constellations, only Orion and the Pleiades are gravitationally linked. Other constellations are illusions of perspective. Pause. This was before I had a radical change in my perspective on our cosmology. What are the stars? Is space travel possible? Where did we get our reality? Unfortunately, our reality comes from Rome, and it's a false reality. But I'll save that for another time. Back to the text. Applying Revelation 12 to the constellations results in surprising specificity. Most scholars agree that the woman is Israel and the child is the foretold Messiah, Yeshua of Nazareth. There is only one female constellation, Virgo, the Virgin, whose chief star is Spica. For 20 days each year, Virgo is literally clothed with the sun. Our sun passes in front of or through Virgo, depending on when. The sun appears to be in the middle of the constellation, Virgo's abdomen. Sometimes, while the sun is passing through Virgo, the moon is at her feet. Norton's star atlas places 12 stars visible to the naked eye around the Virgin's head. Above the Virgin's head can sometimes be found a conjunction between Regulus and Jupiter and the constellation of Leo. Regulus is the king's star, as Jupiter is the king's planet. This alignment was highly prized in presaging a royal birth. Leo is Hebraic symbology for Messiah, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, referencing Genesis 49:9 and Revelation 5:5. At other times, 2 more constellations can be seen below the Virgin, Scorpio and Libra. In ancient days, they were considered to be a single constellation. It is a collection of stars with many associations, not just of the Latin Scorpius, creature with the burning sting, to include that of a dragon. All of these events occur simultaneously on a very specific day in history for a tiny span of 80 minutes. September 11th, 3 BC, what Heiser believes to be the true birthday of Jesus Christ. It appears to be a date the Luciferians are eager to appropriate with their own blood sacrifice. Again, as a quick aside, this is an astounding revelation, if you pardon the pun, and only adds to the suspicion that Michael Heiser is either being fed by Rome or is a Roman himself. Chapter 5, A Sovereign Unto Itself. Most people have no idea that the geographic location of Catholic power, the Vatican, is literally a sovereign city-state, just like ancient Athens or Babylon. Even the word Vatican shows its true origins in pagan rebellion, not dedication to Jesus Christ or to Yahweh. The Vatican is literally a city of the dead built upon the graves of Rome's ancestors, the Etruscans. On those same slopes were grown vineyards to fuel pagan festivals. Next, I cite the Sistine Secrets. Vatica has several other related meanings in ancient Etruscan. It was the name of a bitter grape that grew wild on the slope, which the peasants made into what became infamous as one of the worst, cheapest wines in the ancient world. The name of this wine, which also referred to the slope where it was produced, was Vatica. It was also the name of a strange weed that grew on the graveyard slope. When chewed, it produced wild hallucinations, much like the effect of peyote mushrooms. Thus, Vatica represented what we would call today a cheap high. In this way, the word passed into Latin as a synonym for prophetic vision. Much later, the slope became the circus or stadium of the mad Emperor Nero. It was here, according to church tradition, that's church with a capital C, Catholic Church, that St. Peter was executed, crucified upside down, and then buried nearby. Pause as an aside. And that is precisely put. There are no historical references to such an idea, and it is entirely possible, if not probable, that it was wholly manufactured to disguise the Roman satanic attraction to the upside-down cross. Back to the citation. This became the destination of so many pilgrims that the Emperor Constantine, upon becoming half-Christian, founded a shrine on the spot, which the Romans continued to call the Vatican Slope. A century after Constantine, the Pope started building the papal palace there. Back to the text. In 751 AD, Pope Zachary settled the dispute of who should rule the empire of the Franks by crowning Pepin the Younger. Pepin responded by crushing the Lombards and donating the Exarchate of Ravenna, about half of modern Italy, to Rome. His son Charlemagne would later expand his territory, and Pope Leo III crowned him emperor. French troops remained as mercenaries guarding the Papal States until the mid-19th century. But after the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War, for which Prussia would be severely punished by Rome, Napoleon III recalled his garrison, and Italian nationalists quickly took advantage. The Kingdom of Italy annexed the Papal States in 1870 and left Pope Pius IX with no sovereign territories. He locked himself within his remaining estate and declared that he was a prisoner in the Vatican. Pius IX, Giovanni Mastai Ferretti, was also the first pope to declare himself infallible at the First Vatican Council. This standoff between the Vatican and Italy continued until February of 1929, when a compromise was reached. The Catholic Church would give up her remaining title to land within Italy, but have a new city-state created for her uncontested use to include the massive luxury fortress complex Castel Gandolfo. Pius XI, 2 Piuses later, signed on behalf of the Catholic Church, and Italian Premier Benito Mussolini signed on behalf of King Victor Emmanuel of Italy. Oh, I have a footnote. Readers should note that the convention of popes choosing special names from which to ascend to the office of the Holy See is exactly the same as any other world royal. By such a name, they claim the divine right of rulership over their fellow man. Back to the text. As a result of the Lateran Treaty, Vatican City mints its own coins, controls the flow of mail by creating its own stamps, and stamps that other nations recognize. Just as the United States government has appropriated the top-level internet domain code of .gov, Vatican City has done for the top-level domain .va. The Catholic Church has subsequently reserved the .catholic domain as well. The Papal City-State has its own royal coat of arms. In it are 2 keys, a gold key symbolizing the Pope's authority in the heavens, and a silver key representing his authority among men, or perhaps more accurately, over men. Vatican City has its own Praetorian Guard, the Guardia Svizzera, or Swiss Guard. The Guardia Svizzera are only depicted in the media as Renaissance-era costumed men holding pikes for an honor guard. Nothing could be further from reality. Next, I cite Encyclopedia Britannica. The guards, who are independent of the Swiss armed forces, are employed by the Roman Catholic Church under the leadership of the Pope, to whom they swear fealty in a ceremony at Belvedere Court. As is common with any elite military corps, competition is intense for inclusion in the Swiss Guards. New recruits must be unmarried Roman Catholic males with Swiss citizenship between 19 and 30 years of age and at least 5 feet 8 inches. They must have a professional diploma or high school degree and must complete basic training with the Swiss military. Historically, new recruits also had to prove they were free of physical deformities, and commanding officers were traditionally of noble lineage. As a quick aside, mandating that all Swiss Guard be unmarried has come in handy for many of the priests that accost the guards as they come in and out of the Vatican. No pun intended. Back to the text. When Pope Benedict's former butler, Paolo Gabriele, attempted to expose incidents of corruption amongst church leadership, he was quickly found and arrested by these Vatican police and promptly thrown into Vatican jail. Mirroring disturbing disclosures from the Catholic Church, unmarried guardians have their own homosexual secret society. This has mostly been kept quiet, except for a 1998 double homicide of a gay guardian's commander and wife, suspected of being his bisexual lover. However, in January of 2014, a heterosexual guard broke to the Swiss newspaper Schweiz on Sonntag that he was distressed over the constant propositioning he was enduring at the hands of priests who accosted him while on duty. Within the Swiss Guard is the Catholic Secret Police, known as the Vigilance Office. It handles security for anyone seeking an audience with the Vicar of Christ, which is kept extremely tight. The New York Times reports, the police forces of Italy or any other secular state are not allowed into the Vatican except for group audiences with the Pope. Only the papal staff is permitted to carry out security tasks behind the walls of the pontifical enclave in Rome. Back to the text. Like the Secret Service, the Guardia Svizzera is only as efficient as they are allowed to be. A subheading, We Run the Pope. I next cite Why They Changed the Bible by David Daniels. I had the opportunity to study intensive Spanish in Mexico. On the last day of the course, my young instructor surprised me. He spoke English. I had no idea. He asked me about my Christian faith and then focused his questions on my beliefs about the Bible. Since I had barely been a repentant Christian a year, I had only read through the Bible once by that time. But having taken a couple of courses in my first semester at Pacific Christian College, I summarized Bible history as best I could. He proceeded to tell me my history was all wrong. Then he said something so outlandish about his view of Bible history that it didn't even stick in my memory from that day to this. But it was what he said next that astounded me. Quote, I am a Jesuit priest, unquote, he said as we started out of the classroom for the last time. Then, having gotten my attention, he said, quote, we are not under the Pope. We run the Pope. What the Pope pronounces is only what the broad consensus of people agree to. Then we tell the Pope what to say, and the Pope pronounces it as doctrine, end quote. Back to the text, Russian occultist and mystic Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, 1831 to 1891, considered herself a conduit of ancient wisdom and secret esoteric knowledge. She helped found a research and publishing institute named the Theosophical Society, and her crowning publication was Isis Unveiled. In it, she addressed how the Catholic Church was the tool of a pagan black magic group that calls itself the Society of Jesus. This from Isis Unveiled. The Church is henceforth an inert tool, and the Pope a poor, weak instrument at the hands of this order. But for how long? Until the end comes. Back to the text. Blavatsky accused the Jesuits of steering the entire Church when they claimed fealty unto death for the Pope. Another enlightening source on the inner circle of the elite is Edith Starr Miller, the Lady Queensborough. Archive.org says Edith Starr Miller was a British blue blood on par with Princess Diana. She understood occult religions and secret societies as she experienced them firsthand. Her husband was the first Baron of Queenborough, treasurer of the League of Nations, and member of British Union of Fascists, who helped secure oil monopolies for John Rockefeller. In 1933, she published Occult Theocracy, and showed her readers the Luciferian leanings of whom they thought they elected to serve them. Not surprisingly, Lady Queenborough died shortly after her book was released. She was in the process of getting a divorce from her husband, Almeric High Paget, 72, 1st Baron of Queenborough, on the grounds of cruelty. Next, I cite Edith Starr Miller, murdered for exposing conspiracy. She died suddenly in Paris on January 16th in 1933 at the age of 45. She had been in good health. Even the Grand Lodge of Canada records that she died, quote, under suspicious circumstances, end quote. And we can assume that the Grand Lodge of Canada is Freemasonic. Back to the citation. All records have been lost. No newspaper article or obituary was published. No record of a coroner's report remains. Details of her life have been expunged, save for a New York Times clipping announcing her wedding in 1921. Back to the text. Lady Queenborough noted that Jesuits are so powerful they could break with Rome or simply control the white pope, which appears is what they have been doing for generations. The Jesuits are disturbingly comfortable with absorbing popular paganism. In the 17th and 18th centuries, while conducting missionary work in China, the Jesuits amalgamated Confucianism with their already syncretized Christian pagan beliefs. Not being dedicated Christians, they were only interested in raw power. In an effort to rein in the Jesuits, Clement XI sent his legate Charles Thomas Maillard de Touran to China. Emperor Jiangxi imprisoned de Touran at Macau, where he later perished. According to Lady Queenborough, the emperor had a Jesuit in his ear that was directly responsible for the papal emissary's death. De Touran had just been ordained a cardinal. This war between the black and white popes proves that they obey the Holy See, quote, as a corpse, quote, with, quote, no opinion or will, quote, of their own or any mental reservation whatever. It only suits them. In 1981, when Karol Joseph Wojtyla, Pope John Paul II, attempted to wrest control from the Jesuits by replacing their Superior General Pedro Arrupe with his own appointment, he started a clock ticking. In a few short weeks, an attempt on his life was made. It is extremely interesting to see corporate media blame John Paul for alienating his own Marines. Next is a citation from The Guardian. John Paul alienated the people he needed to have on his side in his grand project of a second evangelization. The Jesuits, with 23,000 members, still the world's biggest male religious order, were the first to feel the lash. When their leader, the much-loved Father Pedro Arrupe, was felled by a stroke in August 1981, John Paul suspended constitutional procedures and imposed a personal delegate of the Holy Father. An 80-year-old Jesuit, Paolo Deza, was named and by astute footwork enabled the tension to subside. 2 years later, the Jesuits calmly elected a new general, Peter Hans Kolbenbach. The attempt to redirect the Jesuits failed. Back to the text, Father Malachi Martin, 1921 to 1999, was one of the most prominent men in the Catholic Church. Author, famed demon exorcist, and personal friend of Pope Paul VI, Martin was amongst the rare few who were granted leave of his association with the Company of Loyola. He later became one of their harshest critics. Pause, as an aside, or so it would seem. Back to the text. In his book, The Jesuits, Martin gave us insights free of media whitewashing. In the spring of 1981, John Paul II had a secret meeting in regards to firing the Black Pope. I cite Martin's The Jesuits. On May 13, 1981, within 3 weeks of that private papal conference to fire Arrupe, John Paul II was struck by 2 bullets from the Browning semi-automatic pistol of paid hitman Mehmet Ali Agca. By mistake, as it was later explained, the pontiff was rushed to the Roman hospital of Gemelli rather than to the special hospital unit organized solely for papal use. He was given blood from the public blood bank. The private supply kept in readiness was never used. In rapid succession, Pope John Paul underwent 2 major operations and suffered the consequences of the transfusion of impure blood. He contracted a severe case of hepatitis. At the height of the pontiff's crisis, on May 28th, Cardinal Wyszynski of Warsaw died. Wyszynski was John Paul's closest friend and had made his career possible. Back to the text, Father Malachi apparently died of a brain hemorrhage after falling down the stairs in his apartment in 1999. There are many, however, who feel that Martin was murdered. Was Martin getting too close to the truth? I cite Father Charles Fiore. At his death, Father Martin was at work on what he said would be his most controversial and important book, entitled Primacy: How the International Roman Catholic Church Became a Creature of the New World Order. It was to deal with power and the papacy and analyze the revolutionary shift in the ancient dogma of primacy that lies at the heart of what many now see as the first breakdown of papal power in 2 millennia. It was to be a book about the Vatican's political landscape as we approach a new pontificate, and as a book of predictions about papal power and the world in the first decades of the new millennium. And that's all we have time for today. Do we believe that? Or was it a massive psychological operation within a psychological operation? For more, tune in next time. I'm Johnny Cirucci.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on satellite, internet, or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening. Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.